Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank you for joining us for this session of our Housing Committee. My name is Jason Palich, and I have the honor of serving as Executive Director of the Partnership. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to our committee co-chairs, but first I just want to go over some housekeeping items briefly. All attendees are muted during today's presentation. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions of our presenters, which can be done by typing questions into the chat or raising your hand aloud to speak. Our committee co-chairs will moderate the Q&A portion. Please note that today's session is being recorded and will be posted for later viewing later today on the partnership's website. Should you experience any technical problems during the session, our immediate guidance is to log out and then log back in. Should you need further assistance, the partnership's Manager of Policy and Planning, Jeremy Thompson, is available to assist you and can be reached via email at jeremy@495partnership.org. I want to thank the Housing Committee co-chairs for their work and leadership. Our public sector co-chair is Sarah Raposa of the town of Medfield, and our private sector co-chair is David McKay of Myrick O'Connell. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Dave to introduce our presenter for this morning.
Well, good morning, folks. Good to see everyone this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce you folks to Jessie Partridge Guerrero. Jessie is the research manager at MAPC, which is the regional planning agency for Greater Boston. She makes data accessible and engaging to the MAPC community through project work, user outreach, and the implementation of compelling data visualizations, graphics, and web design. Her areas of expertise include geographic information systems, GIS, transportation, equity, sustainability, and community-based planning. She holds a Master of Arts in Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning, and a Bachelor of Science in Chemical and Biological Engineering, both from Tufts University. Jessie is going to be joined by Karina Oliver-Milchman, who is the Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development at MAPC. So welcome you both. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to be sharing some research we have done as part of our Metro Common research agenda on housing submarkets. And with that, I will share the screen. We do hope to talk a little bit about how this work is relevant for the 495 MetroWest Partnership, and Karina and I will be excited to engage you all in a conversation after my presentation, which should be just about 20 minutes. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, and if you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll try to notice if folks raise their hand, but please interrupt me if I don't see you. So Greater Boston, as we all know, is one of the most expensive places to live in the country, but it's not one monolithic housing market. And that's really what we're trying to show with this research, and also to show that we can be more targeted in our approach to housing policy to account for all the differences and nuances in the different neighborhoods and different places of Greater Boston. So there's variation in density, in the size and vintage of housing stock, in the availability of renter units, certainly in the prices of housing in the region. These factors influence who can live where and what challenges and opportunities exist for them. And for all the variation in the housing market, there's even more variation in the needs of residents and families when it comes to housing. And we believe that every household should be able to find suitable and stable housing that offers them comfort and opportunity. Yet the reality in Greater Boston is that there are areas of the region that are inaccessible to anyone but the very wealthy, and opportunities and outcomes vary a great deal from one neighborhood to the next. Thinking about all these dynamics, it's clear that we need different housing strategies and interventions in different places to make Greater Boston a better place to live. Most housing planning and policy developments happens at the municipal or state level, which is why we're so excited to be here with you in conversation about the 495 MetroWest Partnership area. Planners often do rely on municipal level statistics to understand housing conditions. But even within municipalities, housing markets can vary a great deal in different neighborhoods. And one neighborhood in one municipality might be more like a neighborhood across the region than it is to its own neighbor. So how do we account for these differences within municipalities and the similarities across the region in order to take a more targeted approach to housing policy and improve housing conditions throughout the region? So very quickly, a submarket is a collection of neighborhoods, some next to each other, some not, that share similarities in housing stock and housing market characteristics. These characteristics determine who can find, afford, and remain in suitable housing in a given place. Very quickly on our research methods, we were inspired for this research by our peers in the Chicago region who published their own submarkets back in 2017, and we adapted their methods for our own submarkets research. We used these data variables to characterize housing market conditions in the region. They can be kind of generally categorized in these 4 buckets. So housing stock, looking at the density of housing, number of units, the vintage of year built, looking at prices, including home sale and rents, market forces like business buyers and cash sales, as well as change over time across a lot of these variables. We use census tract level data from mostly publicly available sources, including the Census Bureau and HUD, as well as Warren Group real estate transactions, which we purchased from the Warren Group. And we identified the submarkets through using a latent profile analysis, or an LPA, which is a statistical classification method that groups units, which in our case are census tracts, that are similar to each other based on their shared characteristics. And the characteristics that we've looked at are those data variables that I showed on the previous slide. The result of this LPA analysis is 7 distinct submarkets, which represent different combinations of housing market characteristics in the region. We did only do analysis for the 101 cities and towns in Greater Boston in the MAPC region. So some of the 495 municipalities outside of the 495 belt are actually, we don't have information for in this analysis. So you can see these are our 7 submarkets, ranging from submarket 1 here in the inner core. This is our densest submarket, out to submarket 7 in blue, which forms sort of a band around the region and is has the lowest density on average of all the submarkets. We did order submarkets 1 through 7 based on highest to lowest housing density. The colors don't represent any other meaning, they're just meant to be categorical. And I'm going to go through each of the 7 submarkets in a little bit more detail so you can get a feel for them. Starting with submarket 1, again, the small but dense submarket concentrated in the very core of the region. It's characterized by some of the highest home prices in the region and has had the steepest increase in home prices and rents since 2000 of all the submarkets. Sale prices have increased an average of 75% since 2000, and rents have increased an average of almost 30% in the last decade. This is actually the only submarket that you don't see in the 495 MetroWest Partnership area. So the rest of the remaining 6 submarkets are found in your region. Submarket 2 is the second most dense submarket, characterized by lower housing costs and the highest renter share of all the submarkets. More than 3/4 of housing units are renter occupied. It's also experienced high rates of foreclosure and cash sales and has the highest average rate of business buyers. Almost 20% of home sales in submarket 2 have been to a business buyer. Submarket 2 can be found in areas of Boston, like Roxbury and Mattapan, also areas of Lynn, and you can see out in your region in Framingham. Submarket 3 is comprised of moderate density urban centers. It has the oldest housing stock in the region, and the majority of housing in submarket 3 is small multifamily homes. So duplexes, triple deckers, and 4 families make up more than half of housing stock in the submarket. And it can be found in areas of Boston and Dorchester, also a great part of Somerville, submarket 3, and then out in your region in Marlborough, Framingham, and Milford. Submarket 4 is a lower density mix of suburban and regional urban areas characterized by older housing stock, low housing costs, and minimal change in rents. And it's actually had the slowest population growth of the 7 submarkets. You can see it really scattered throughout the region, up here in Gloucester, in areas of your region, Maynard, Hudson, Marlborough, all the way down to Milford, Natick. I apologize, I don't know all of municipalities, and I should know all the municipalities in the region, but I don't. Submarket 5 is the highest cost submarket in the region. It's found in low density suburban areas like Lexington and Weston, also Wayland in your region. It's also in parts of older streetcar suburbs like Brookline and Newton. Average home sale prices in Submarket 5 approach $1 million. So it is really quite expensive. It has a low share of renters, and that share has actually declined in the last decade. Submarket 6 is a low density suburban submarket with low housing costs, but relatively high rent. It has the newest housing stock on average and has seen rapid increases in density, rents, and renter households. An average of about 40% of housing units in the Submarket 6 are renter occupied, which is an increase of 18% over the last decade. You can also see it in your region in Boxborough, Hudson, Marlborough, Milford, and other areas. And then Submarket 7, which is our lowest density submarket by quite a bit. It's characterized by predominantly single family homes and very few renter units. Only 8% of units in the submarket are occupied by renters. And it's like I said, it kind of forms this band around the outside of the region, and you can see a fair amount of the municipalities and the area in the 495 MetroWest Partnership is covered by Submarket 7. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but we were interested in, so now we have our submarkets. What are conditions, sort of non-housing conditions, like for the people who live in these 7 submarkets? So we overlaid data over the submarket map and summarized the data by submarket. We looked at demographics, so we looked at people by race, ethnicity, language, and age. We looked at public school performance and college attainment. We looked at access to jobs and unemployment. And then a few more housing characteristics that weren't part of our submarket analysis. We looked at housing cost burden and home mortgage loans. And we did look into the legacy of redlining as it compares to the 7 submarkets. So I'm gonna do a quick site tour. If I can, oh no, I don't want to stop sharing, sorry. I want to get out of my slideshow and then take you to the website, so housing-submarkets.mapc.org. This is the landing page. You can see it's the full extent of the map of the MAPC region. And this panel over here serves as both a legend and a description area for the 7 submarkets. So we have key highlighted information about the 7 submarkets and sort of a subtitle. So submarket 1 is that magenta area in the inner core with the high density urban prices, and you can tab through to each of the other submarkets. You can also turn them on and off if you want to look just at one particular submarket. And then you can either go to the submarkets landing page, which I'll do in a minute, or if you want to go directly to submarket 3, you can go to view full profile. I'm going to take you to this submarkets page, which has a little bit of more information, most of which I've talked about in my slides. And then you can pick which submarket you'd like to look at. So I'll just jump into submarket 3. And then on each submarket page, we have a longer description of the housing characteristics that make up that submarket. And we have this great interactive data visualization, which actually takes, I think, either 10 or a dozen of the variables we use in our submarket analysis. So not all of them, but some of the core, most interesting variables, and maps them so that you can see the landing layer is median sale price. So you can see lowest in the light purple to darkest purple, going from low to high, median sale price. And then what you can do is you can click on a census tract. So let's click on the census tract in Marlboro, and it's going to highlight that census tract showing which submarket it's in, so submarket 6, and then the distribution of that submarket compared to all of the other census tracts in the region. So each of these purple lines represents a census tract, and you can see here the median sale price in that census tract in Marlboro is just under $400,000. It's part of submarket 6. We can also click on, let's click on another. Let's go over to Bolton. And you can see Bolton in submarket 7 is sort of in the middle of the distribution for submarket 7 and closer. I think that's more than $500,000. And these data are all available in a download on our data commons. Then we have a section about the people, conditions, and context in the submarket. So these are those variables that we overlaid and summarized by submarket. And we've gone into detail about the conditions in each of the 7 submarkets. We've also included some of these charts, which kind of give a summary of information about individual characteristics. So here you can see the percent change in population with a bachelor's degree or more. And you can see submarket 3 has actually had the highest increase in bachelor's degree share. You can tab over to submarket 4, and I won't go through it all again, but you can go through and see a different chart with kind of information that's critical about submarket 4. And you can go through to all of the 7 submarkets. So I'm going to jump over to the policy strategy page because that's really what we want to focus on for the rest of this conversation. We really hope that this research is a resource for policy implementation and development. And so what we've done is we've kind of put the core housing strategies that we think are most critical for the region to work on. And we've organized them. So you can see here, this column is the strategy or the strategy group, ranging from housing stability protections and community ownership of land down to revenue sources for affordable housing and multifamily production strategies. And these are the 7 submarkets here on these columns. And we've checked those strategies which are most critical for the individual submarkets that are checked. So we're not saying that these strategies aren't useful for other submarkets. So certainly affordable housing production strategies are important in submarkets 2, 3, 4, but they're not the most critical strategies for those submarkets. Whereas in submarket 1, 5, and 7, we believe affordable housing production strategies are critical and should be prioritized. And then in this last column, we have specific policy examples, which give you just a sample of the policies that we've researched. Actually, Karina's team developed through our Metro Mayor's Housing Task Force, which we've also linked to down here. So if you want to explore those in more detail, you can go to housingtaskforce.mapc.org. And then we've also, under each of the strategy groups, we've created this dropdown so you can look at those example policies in a little bit more detail. And then last thing I want to show you on the website is you can go to the municipalities tab and you can actually search for a municipality in your region or that you live in or work in. Let me type in Hudson and it should come up. As long as it's in the MAPC region, it'll come up. And then this gives you a distribution of the submarkets by the share of households they represent. So in Hudson, there's just under 8,000 households, and 44% of those households are in submarket 4. a third are in submarket 6, and 23% of households in Hudson are in submarket 7. And then you can get a peek for the housing strategy examples that in submarket 7 we've recommended. So someone in Hudson might want to dig more into those strategies for that area of the town. You can also click onto the neighboring or any municipality on the map to find the information for that municipality. So that's most of the information on the website. Let me just quickly go back to my presentation to wrap up. I just wanted to end with a few concluding thoughts. So we really hope this research can provide a regional picture of housing dynamics and a way for local stakeholders such as yourselves to better understand housing market dynamics within your own municipalities and your region. We also want to foster connections between local stakeholders grappling with similar challenges across the region to share ideas and strategies. So both within your 495 MetroWest partnership, you saw there were multiple neighborhoods or areas within each municipality that had a shared submarket with another municipality, but also across the region. We also hope this research can facilitate the creation and implementation of targeted policy responses and community development strategies, which is what we hope to talk about in just a minute. And we hope to enable research that's relevant to the needs and challenges of each submarket. So if you're interested in diving more deeply into any of the areas of this, this analysis with a research project, please reach out to Karina or me, and we will work with you to put together a research project. And then ultimately, we hope it can be a resource for making better housing policies for a better region. And with that, here is the contact information for Karina and me if you want to get in touch. And I'll end, and we can have a conversation about housing policy and the submarket.
Wow, Jessie, thank you so much for all of that really impressive data research that you've presented. I'm Sarah Raposa. I'm going to be leading the Q&A portion of the presentation. And I wanted to introduce Karina Oliver-Milchman. She's the Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development at MAPC. And she works with cities and towns to develop implementable housing production plans, draft zoning, and otherwise develop implementable strategies to expand housing opportunities. Karina's area of expertise includes barriers to affordability and housing production and displacement risk and mitigation. She has presented on these and other topics at the American Planning Association National Conference, Railvolution, Congress for New Urbanism, YIMBYtown, and other events. And she holds a master's in city planning and certificate in urban design from MIT. And she is a AICP planner. So I just wanted to ask you guys, this is really interesting research, and I know that it's part of what you are doing as part of your Metro Common planning. Was there any comparison made between the Metro Future era housing typologies that you had any key findings on?
Are you referring to the community types from Metro Future?
Yeah.
So actually, the community types were part of the inspiration for this analysis. Those are really focused on typologies for all different sorts of characteristics around density, around people, around housing. And we wanted to dive more deeply into housing characteristics because it's just such a rich, there's so much information about housing, and housing is one of the greatest kind of challenges that the region has. So, there are sort of connections between the housing submarkets and the community types that we've found, which are interesting, kind of thinking about those regional urban centers, which I referenced a few times. So there are submarkets that are clustered either within the regional urban centers or just on the outskirts of the kind of denser centers of those regional urban areas. But there was no kind of like direct input of the community types into this the submarket kind of LPA analysis.
I would add, I think this latest analysis that Jessie and her team did is just much more granular and more nuanced than those community types, because it's at the submarket level rather than the municipal wide scale. And so we've already started using those in planning, zoning, and other implementation processes to really understand what's happening at a local and hyper-local level. So we recently completed a housing production plan where there was a really different, very different dynamics and trends going on in the downtown than the surrounding submarkets. And that was really helpful from a planning process and determining what kind of strategies are needed to address housing need and demand in a community, which is also added value to this process because the community types were kind of purely based on contextual understanding rather than taking this next step of what kind of strategies are appropriate for what kind of context.
Yeah, you can tell you're thinking very, very deeply about this. And so I was very enthusiastic to get my question out, but I forgot to mention that really this is for everybody who's attending. So if you have a question and you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you so that you can ask Jessie and Karina yourself.
And Sarah, if it's all right, I'd like to actually throw in with a question myself. And actually, I'm wondering if you might be able to just both for an example and also for relevance to our service area. So in terms of the various policy recommendations, which I know that the partnership is interested in, our audience is interested in, our housing committee is in its fledgling infancy stages. We're just starting to have some of these regional conversations. Submarket 7. Which is clearly, by looking at the map, one of the more predominant ones in our region. Obviously, MAPC and the 495 MetroWest Partnership service areas don't overlap perfectly. We have some municipalities which are not covered by MAPC, but I guess if you went further west to cover our entire service area, you'd see a lot more of that blue color. Jessie, I'm wondering if you can walk through for Submarket 7 an example of some of the policy recommendations that might be there, because I really feel like not only would that help folks perhaps to get a better sense of what some of these strategies look like, but that is also the sub-region that I think is most pronounced and probably present in just about all of our communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yes, Submarket 7 definitely covers a large part of the area. And I think it's really important to talk through the strategies that we've identified that are most important for that submarket. I mean, I definitely don't want to lose that you do have a rich kind of like diversity of submarkets, because you have 6 of the 7 submarkets, which I think is really remarkable. Submarket 7, we have identified 3 of the strategy groups that are most critical, including affordable production strategies. So things like inclusionary zoning, affordable housing, expedited permitting, revenue sources for affordable housing, which is super important. Thinking about real estate transfer fees, anti-speculation tax or vacancy tax as some examples, and then multifamily production strategies, of which we have a lot of ideas. So zoning for multifamily housing at the basic level, zoning for accessory dwelling units, density bonuses, reducing or eliminating parking requirements or lowering parking ratios, and then property tax exemption and abatement for new development. And so those are the kind of critical examples that we have come up with for Submarket 7. Karina, do you want to jump in with any more specific thoughts?
No, I would just say I think housing choice will be a key enabling piece of legislation in terms of advancing this production goal and particularly with affordable housing target, which isn't baked into housing choice right now, and so does need to be layered in at the local level. But hopefully by reducing the voting threshold from 2/3 to simple majority for certain kinds of residential zoning in appropriate locations, it'll make it easier to build support for and pass multifamily zoning or accessory dwelling units. And the other point I would make, sorry, too much coffee this morning, is there's really a range of housing types. We like to talk about housing diversity a lot, and that gets into scale all the way from the low end to 80, at like ADUs to something higher density, like multifamily over structured parking. But there's so much in between, and we tend to not see a lot of that in our communities in the region because they're not zoned for it. So they're not zoned for townhomes or cottage cluster or courtyard apartments, and all of that can be really appropriate housing for residential neighborhoods, and as you go up into village centers or town centers. And so I think thinking sensitively about what kind of housing makes sense where, what kind of housing affords the opportunity to bake in affordable housing, because you do tend to need a certain amount of scale to make that happen, to make that financially feasible. But I think people think of the scale along the lines of a large 40B, which doesn't necessarily need to be the case depending on your market. It could be a 6-unit or a 10-unit multifamily development that sets aside 10 or 15% of units as affordable. So I think I would just add that.
Thank you.
I'll just piggyback another thought on this topic, which is just the importance of making Submarket 7 more accessible to more residents of the region, because I didn't go into detail about the kind of conditions in the submarket, but Submarket 7 has some of the best outcomes in terms of educational attainment, in terms of housing cost burden is the lowest in Submarket 7. And yet it's only 8% renters, as I mentioned. It's also the whitest submarket in the region. It's almost 90% white residents on average. So I think the conversation about making the submarket more accessible is really important. Thinking about segregation in the region, thinking about kind of wealth inequality, and all of these other kind of really important elements that housing is really kind of tied to.
I'll build on that for a minute to plug Jessie's other latest research project, which is the Zoning Atlas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it really does put in stark contrast the places within the region that have zoned for multifamily development versus which is defined as just 2 units or more, versus the places that are really limited to traditional single family housing. And obviously the latter is really dominant across our region. This intersects with research done by Amy Dane on the state of multifamily housing, which found that there were a very high number of municipalities that didn't zone for any kind of multifamily, particularly at the densities that the state is looking for in terms of 12 units per acre for the new MBTA multifamily mandate, for example, or 40R, which also has a minimum density threshold. So I think there's a real connection to zoning and who gets to live where. And the other thing I would just throw out there is MAPC does have a new database. It's not publicly available, but we're integrating it into our planning processes right now of different housing types, 3D models of 20 or so housing types to give an impression of what do these different kinds of housings look and feel like in terms of scale and how they are oriented at the parcel level on the site. And I think that hopefully will help build some excitement around, alternatives to single family housing, because there are very many. And I'll be giving a presentation on that with Chris Kletchman, who'll be speaking about housing choice tomorrow at the Housing Institute, if anyone's registered for that.
Excellent. And maybe we can actually find a link for that and throw it into the chat. A follow-up, actually, if I may, on Submarket 7, and actually, Jessie, just is something you just walked through actually a little bit, some of the demographic characteristics of Submarket 7. It occurs to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Submarket 7 is probably one of the faster growing submarkets, and I'm curious if MAPC is planning to monitor if there is any changes in the coming years. I know obviously you just completed this work. It occurs to me that of the Submarket 7 might be most likely to experience either demographic changes or changes in density over the coming years. I'm curious if you've had any early thoughts about tracking in the future, if you see any shifts.
Yeah, so we're actually in the process now of putting together our indicators that we will be monitoring as part of Metro Common. So we had, I don't know if any of you are familiar with our regional indicators program, but we had a series of indicator reports that we published as part of Metro Future. So we will be kind of rethinking that program for Metro Common and coming up with indicators that are kind of critical to watch over time. And certainly we'll be pulling from this analysis. Whether we update this analysis, this housing submarket typology analysis in another 5 years or so is kind of to be determined, depending on you know, how useful it proves to be for folks and how much interest there is in updating it. But certainly individual elements of change, such as population demographics, such as you know, renter characteristics, we'll certainly be watching. And we're interested in input. What are the indicators that you think are most valuable for us to be kind of updating and publishing as part of our Metro Common indicators?
Well, I just updated the chat with both the web link for the housing submarket.mapc.org and then also the zoning atlas that Karina just mentioned that Jessie's working on is zoningatlas.mapc.org. I think I got those right. And then Karina posted the Housing Institute's website for her presentation tomorrow afternoon. Great. Do we have any other questions?
Sarah, I'd like to chime in with a quick question, if that's okay.
Of course, Jeremy, thanks.
This is just a bit of a technical question first. I know that MAPC has also the mass builds map. I was wondering, is that an overlay option when accessing the housing submarkets data? I don't want to open it because I'm gingerly I don't want my computer to crash basically, and I've got some links open, so I don't want to risk it. But I was just curious if you could see the relationship between new construction, specifically of multifamily housing, where that is built within the municipality and where that falls within the submarket typology. I think that would be fascinating. I'm wondering if that's an option that the team has explored.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent idea. We haven't done it. It wouldn't be that challenging to do, and it's something that we can look into. And I definitely think it would be telling. I mean, we did look at change in housing density over time. We looked at change in renter units, which mass build mostly focuses on larger developments. So it's mostly looking at large multifamily units. But I do think it would be interesting to overlay and summarize mass builds across our housing submarkets. In particular, actually, submarket 6 has seen the biggest increase in renter units, and I'm really curious just to like dive into submarket 6, maybe find the mass builds entries that are located there and see what kinds of housing those are, or what kinds of developments those are. So thanks for that idea.
I think there's cool analyses we can do at the local level if we were partnering with any individual municipality, which would include digging into permitting data or development pipeline. I think overlaying zoning would be really illustrative, and also maybe some of the housing choice data, Jessie, on permitting. Any housing choice communities have provided the state with really good permitting data, which I know can be hard to collect. So that's a great opportunity there.
And if I could just jump in, I'm curious actually if you could maybe touch a little bit on the timeline of your study, and as a related question, if you feel that COVID-19 or the pandemic had any impact on this. You know, what we hear anecdotally out in our communities is that there has been an explosion in single family home purchasing. You know, you hear about people leaving the cities, changing patterns. I'm curious, when did you start this work? Do you think that the pandemic may have impacted any of what you saw?
No and yes. So we started this research probably in 2019 and wrapped it up. We wrapped up the analysis in 2020, or no, in maybe very early 2020, and then got to work on the website and the data visualizations. So the data do not include 2020 information. In fact, the census data that we used is probably the 2018 vintage. So it is because there's a lag in the census data, which is always unfortunate. But absolutely, I mean, I think what we saw in 2020, and I, through other research projects, have seen this very clearly, both in home sale prices kind of rapidly increasing across the region, and also rents declining in particular in the inner core and high density urban areas. Now, the caveat is that I think all of those trends are just reversing and going back to the way they were. I mean, I don't know the sale market yet, but the rental market, certainly prices have already jumped back up. We saw this very clear dip through 2020 and early 2021, and it started jumping right back up. And in fact, April had the steepest rent price increase that we've seen. So, 2020 certainly would have changed some of the trends on this map, but I almost am glad we don't have it because I think it's maybe a blip. I mean, it's certainly important for us to think about what the pandemic, the impact the pandemic had on housing, and certainly the lasting impact it will have on housing and people's ability to afford their housing. But the data trends were certainly not what we've seen or what we would have expected.
I think in terms of increased demand for single family, whether it was temporary due to the pandemic or whether we're going to see that as an ongoing trend, this comes up in discussion of single families all the time. It's really hard to build them at a price point that's affordable to anyone but incredibly wealthy people in terms of new construction. And that's, a combination of factors, including zoning, but you can really only do so much with zoning. You can do a lot. But when it comes to single family, there's really only so much you can do to create opportunities for more affordable single family homes through the regulatory system. And that's because the demand is so high, the land costs are so high, and construction costs are so high. So it's not just, the permitting process adding extra time and risk, like with multifamily development, for example, where you could compensate for some of those high land and construction costs through economies of scale. So I think it's important to remember that the uptick in demand for single family housing is coming from a very particular kind of buyer, or even range of buyers. And there's a huge segment of the market that's not being served by that housing type that, a portion could maybe be served by amending zoning, but we're never going to serve, the majority of people with single family housing, even if we had the land available to do that, which we really don't.
That's a really good thought. Thank you. Really appreciate this. Jason, should we wrap it up for today?
So I want to thank Jessie and Karina and MAPC for their work on this project and for presenting to us today. This is something that certainly the 495 MetroWest Partnership and our audience are particularly interested in. We're excited for the work that you're doing and to hope to continue to partner you as we've long been great partners with MAPC and trying to explore what we can do, obviously, to create more housing of varied types throughout our region, but also as we have more conversations focused on policy, we have a lot of data through MAPC and some information that we can now consider to enhance the quality of those conversations. So with that, on behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank everyone for participating today, and I want to thank our viewers for viewing the recorded program later on. You can certainly visit MAPC's website for more information. We will be posting the link to the Housing Submarket study, along with a link to the recording of this presentation later on. And certainly to learn more about the 495 MetroWest Partnership, we encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter updates, which you can do online at 495partnership.org. So on behalf of the partnership, thank you to Jessie and Karina and everyone for joining us this morning. Take care,
everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.